In the autumn of 1873, along the muddy expanse of the Missouri River near Independence, Missouri, the Blackwood family operated what locals considered the finest boarding house between Kansas City and St. Louis. Martha and Ezra Blackwood, along with their two teenage children, Samuel and Rebecca, had built a reputation for hospitality that drew weary travelers from hundreds of miles around. Their whitewashed farmhouse, with its wraparound porch and welcoming yellow lamplight, became a beacon of comfort for merchants, settlers, and wanderers crossing the harsh frontier. What those travelers didn't know was that in the span of 18 months, 47 guests had entered the Blackwood boarding house, and none had ever been seen leaving alive. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came not from the missing travelers, but from the Blackwood family's sudden and complete disappearance on the morning of November 15, 1873, when the mail carrier, Benjamin Curtis, arrived for his weekly delivery. He found the front door standing wide open, breakfast still warm on the kitchen table, and absolutely no trace of the four family members who had lived there for over a decade. But it was what investigators found in the cellar that would haunt the Missouri Territory for generations to come, and force an entire community to confront the horrifying realization that they had been living alongside something that defied every understanding of human nature and Christian morality. For Martha Blackwood, the art of hospitality had begun innocently enough. Born Martha Henley in 1831, she had grown up in a devout Methodist household in Ohio, where her mother had instilled in her the sacred duty of caring for strangers and travelers. "The Lord commands us to welcome the stranger," her mother would say while preparing extra portions for unexpected guests. "You never know when you might be entertaining angels unaware." Martha carried this philosophy with her when she married Ezra Blackwood in 1849 and followed him to Missouri, where land was cheap and opportunities were plentiful for those willing to work hard and treat others with kindness. Their first years were marked by genuine warmth and authentic generosity. Travelers who stayed with the Blackwoods during the 1850s and early 1860s consistently reported exceptional treatment, comfortable accommodations, and hearty meals that reminded them of their own family kitchens. Ezra Blackwood had fought with distinction in the Union Army during the Civil War, serving under General Nathaniel Lyon at the Battle of Wilson's Creek. The war changed him in ways that those who knew him before could never quite articulate. He returned home in 1863 with a pronounced limp, a nervous habit of checking over his shoulder even in safe surroundings, and an intensity in his pale gray eyes that hadn't been there when he left for the battlefield. Martha noticed the change immediately. Her husband, once quick to laugh and generous with his affections, became withdrawn and brooding. He spent long hours sitting on the front porch, whittling pieces of wood into increasingly intricate and disturbing shapes. The carvings began as simple animals, horses and birds, but gradually evolved into more complex and unsettling forms. Twisted human figures with elongated limbs, faces contorted in expressions of agony, and creatures that seemed to be part human, part beast. Samuel, born in 1855, and Rebecca, born in 1857, grew up during their father's transformation. They learned to read his moods, to recognize the warning signs that preceded his dark episodes, and to understand that their family was fundamentally different from their neighbors. Samuel inherited his father's intensity and his mother's gift for reading people, but combined these traits with a precocious intelligence that often disturbed adults who interacted with him. Rebecca was quieter, more observant, with an uncanny ability to anticipate what people needed before they knew it themselves. The Blackwood children learned early that their parents discussed certain subjects only when they believed their children were asleep. Late-night conversations conducted in hushed whispers near the kitchen fire, discussions about travelers who had stayed with them, comments about which guests had been carrying money or valuable possessions, and increasingly detailed observations about human behavior under stress. What Martha and Ezra didn't realize was that Samuel and Rebecca had been listening to these conversations from the top of the stairs for years, absorbing every word, and beginning to understand that their family's hospitality served purposes beyond simple Christian charity. The transformation of the Blackwood boarding house from a legitimate business into something far darker began gradually, almost imperceptibly. The first incident occurred in the summer of 1871, when a traveling merchant named Harold Gaines arrived at the boarding house carrying a leather satchel containing what he claimed was over $300 in gold coins. Gaines was a boastful man who drank too much whiskey and talked too freely about his business dealings. During dinner on his second night at the boarding house, he regaled the Blackwood family with stories of his successful trading ventures, his upcoming marriage to a wealthy widow in Kansas City, and the substantial dowry he was carrying to contribute to the wedding arrangements. Martha listened to Gaines's stories with what appeared to be genuine interest, asking questions about his bride-to-be and commenting on how wonderful it must be to have such bright prospects for the future. Ezra nodded along, occasionally refilling Gaines's whiskey glass and complimenting the merchant on his business acumen. Samuel and Rebecca sat quietly at the table, observing the interaction with the intense focus that had become characteristic of both children. That evening, after Gaines had retired to his room, Martha found herself unable to sleep. She lay in bed listening to her husband's steady breathing, thinking about the merchant's gold coins, and considering how that money could transform her family's circumstances. $300 represented more than the boarding house typically earned in an entire year. It could pay off their debts, provide security for Samuel and Rebecca's futures, and eliminate the constant financial pressure that had been weighing on the family since Ezra's return from the war. The thought should have troubled Martha's Christian conscience, but instead, she found it strangely comforting. Harold Gaines was traveling alone, with no family expecting him at any particular time. He had made it clear that he was essentially a stranger in Kansas City, with no close connections beyond his intended bride, who knew him only through correspondence. If something were to happen to Gaines during his travels, it might be weeks or even months before anyone noticed his absence. Martha spent that entire night considering possibilities, weighing moral obligations against practical necessities, and gradually convincing herself that her family's survival might justifiably take precedence over the welfare of a stranger who had been foolish enough to advertise his wealth to people he barely knew. The following morning, Martha prepared an unusually elaborate breakfast for Harold Gaines, featuring fresh eggs, thick-cut bacon, cornbread with honey, and coffee brewed strong enough to mask any additional flavors that might have been added to it. She had spent considerable time that morning gathering herbs from her garden, consulting a book of folk remedies that her mother had given her years earlier, and carefully measuring proportions of ingredients that most people would never consider combining in a breakfast meal. Gaines consumed the meal with obvious enjoyment, praising Martha's cooking and commenting on how much he would miss such excellent food once he reached Kansas City. As he ate, Martha watched his face carefully, noting when his expressions began to change, when his movements became less coordinated, and when his speech started to slur in ways that couldn't be attributed entirely to his previous night's whiskey consumption. Ezra appeared in the kitchen just as Gaines was finishing his coffee, carrying a length of rope that he claimed he needed for repairing a broken fence post. But Martha noticed that her husband's eyes were fixed on Harold Gaines with an intensity that had nothing to do with morning conversation or casual politeness. Samuel and Rebecca watched from the doorway, both children displaying an alertness that seemed inappropriate for the mundane domestic scene playing out before them. When Harold Gaines attempted to stand from the breakfast table, his legs buckled underneath him. He looked around the kitchen with confusion, trying to understand why his body was no longer responding to his commands. Martha moved quickly to his side, expressing concern about his condition and suggesting that he might have eaten something that disagreed with him during his travels. "Don't you worry, Mr. Gaines," Martha said, her voice filled with motherly concern. "We'll take good care of you until you're feeling better. Sometimes these frontier foods can be hard on folks who aren't used to them." Ezra helped support Gaines as they moved him to a chair near the kitchen fire, where he could rest while the mysterious illness ran its course. But instead of improving, Gaines's condition deteriorated rapidly. His breathing became shallow, his skin took on a grayish pallor, and his eyes began to lose focus as whatever Martha had added to his breakfast took full effect. Samuel and Rebecca continued watching from the doorway, their young faces displaying in fascination with Gaines's declining condition that should have been disturbing to any adult observer. But Martha and Ezra were too focused on the practical aspects of their situation to pay attention to their children's reactions. When Harold Gaines finally stopped breathing, approximately 2 hours after finishing his breakfast, the Blackwood family found themselves faced with a decision that would determine the course of their lives for the next 2 years. They could report Gaines's death to local authorities, explain that he had apparently succumbed to some form of food poisoning, and deal with the investigation and questions that would inevitably follow, or they could handle the situation privately, in a way that would protect their family and provide them with the financial security they desperately needed. Martha opened Harold Gaines's leather satchel while his body was still cooling in the kitchen chair. The gold coins were exactly as he had described them, more money than the Blackwood family had ever seen at one time. Ezra counted the coins methodically, separating them into piles and calculating the total value with the precision of a man who had learned to appreciate the importance of accurate accounting during his military service. Samuel and Rebecca approached the table where their parents were examining Gaines's money, both children showing no signs of distress about the presence of a dead body in their kitchen. Rebecca reached out to touch one of the gold coins, turning it over in her small hand and examining it with curiosity, rather than fear or moral concern. "Where will we put him?" Samuel asked, his question delivered with the same tone he might have used to ask about storing firewood or preserving meat for the winter. Ezra looked at his son with something that might have been pride or might have been recognition of a kindred spirit. "The cellar has good, deep earth," he said, "and it's private. Nobody goes down there except family." Martha felt a moment of hesitation as she looked at Harold Gaines's lifeless form, but the feeling passed quickly when she considered the alternative. Her family had been struggling financially for years. Ezra's war injuries had limited his ability to do physical labor, and the boarding house business had never been profitable enough to provide real security for Samuel and Rebecca's futures. Harold Gaines's gold could change everything, and Gaines himself had made it clear that nobody would be looking for him for quite some time. The burial took place that evening, with the entire Blackwood family participating in the grim work of digging a grave in the earthen floor of their cellar. Ezra handled most of the physical labor despite his war injuries, while Martha organized the logistics and Samuel and Rebecca helped move dirt and equipment. The work was completed in near silence, with each family member focused on their assigned tasks and nobody questioning the morality of what they were doing. When Harold Gaines was finally buried beneath 6 feet of cellar earth, Martha said a brief prayer over the gravesite. She asked God to forgive them for what they had done and to understand that they had acted out of necessity rather than malice. She promised that they would use Gaines's money responsibly, to provide for their children's education, and to improve their family's circumstances in ways that would honor his inadvertent sacrifice. But even as Martha spoke these words, she was already thinking about the practical lessons they had learned from the experience. Harold Gaines had made himself a target by advertising his wealth, by traveling alone, and by failing to maintain appropriate caution when dealing with strangers. Future guests would need to be selected more carefully, approached more strategically, and handled with greater attention to avoiding suspicion from local authorities. The Blackwood family's transformation from legitimate boarding house operators into something far more sinister was complete. What they didn't yet understand was how quickly they would have opportunities to apply their new knowledge, or how easily they would adapt to viewing human beings as sources of income rather than fellow travelers deserving of Christian hospitality. Within 3 weeks of Harold Gaines's burial, another traveler arrived at the Blackwood boarding house, carrying visible signs of wealth and displaying the kind of careless trust that the family had learned to recognize as vulnerability. Martha greeted the new guest with the same warm hospitality that had built their reputation, but now her kindness served purposes that went far beyond simple Christian charity. Samuel and Rebecca watched from the windows as their mother showed the new arrival to his room, both children already beginning to speculate about how long this guest might stay with them, what he might be carrying in his travel bags, and how his visit might contribute to their family's rapidly improving financial situation. They had learned that their parents possessed knowledge and capabilities that other families lacked, and they were eager to continue their education in these dark arts that seemed to promise security and prosperity beyond anything their neighbors could imagine. The second death was easier than the first, the third easier still. By the winter of 1871, the Blackwood family had developed a system that allowed them to evaluate potential victims, eliminate witnesses, and dispose of evidence with efficiency that would have impressed military strategists. They had also begun to understand that their isolation and their reputation for hospitality provided them with perfect camouflage for activities that would have horrified their Methodist neighbors. But what Martha and Ezra had not anticipated was how thoroughly their children would embrace these new family traditions, or how quickly Samuel and Rebecca would begin contributing ideas of their own for improving their parents' methods. The Blackwood boarding house was becoming something unprecedented in the Missouri Territory, a place where hospitality had been transformed into a sophisticated form of predation, and where a seemingly normal family had discovered that murder could be not only profitable, but deeply satisfying in ways they had never imagined possible. By the spring of 1872, the Blackwood family had refined their methods to an art form that combined Martha's knowledge of medicinal herbs, Ezra's military precision, and their children's increasingly sophisticated understanding of human psychology. They had learned to identify ideal targets through careful observation and conversation, to eliminate witnesses without arousing suspicion, and to dispose of evidence in ways that left no trace for potential investigators. Samuel, now 17, had developed an uncanny ability to read people's intentions and vulnerabilities within minutes of meeting them. He possessed his father's intensity combined with his mother's gift for inspiring trust, but these traits had been shaped by 2 years of watching his parents systematically murder strangers for profit. Samuel understood that most people revealed their deepest secrets and fears when they believed themselves to be in a safe, welcoming environment, and he had learned to exploit this tendency with remarkable skill. Rebecca, 15, Darcy, had inherited her mother's attention to detail and her father's tactical thinking, but she applied these abilities to studying the physical and emotional responses of people under extreme stress. She had observed dozens of deaths by this point, cataloging the different ways that various poisons affected their victims, noting which methods caused the most suffering and which allowed for the quietest elimination of witnesses. The family's system had evolved into something that resembled a well-orchestrated military operation. Martha would engage potential victims in conversation during their initial arrival, assessing their wealth, their travel plans, and their connections to people who might notice their absence. Ezra would evaluate their physical capabilities and determine the most efficient methods for overpowering them if necessary. Samuel would gain their trust and extract information about their backgrounds and destinations, while Rebecca would prepare whatever combination of herbs and poisons would be most appropriate for their specific victim. The breakfast ritual had become their signature method. Martha had discovered that most travelers were hungry and grateful for a substantial morning meal, especially after sleeping in the comfortable beds that the Blackwood boarding house was known for throughout the region. The combination of warm food, strong coffee, and apparently genuine hospitality created an atmosphere where even cautious individuals would let down their guard completely. But Martha had also learned to vary her approach depending on the victim. Older travelers received gentle doses of heart-stopping herbs that would appear to be natural cardiac failure. Younger, stronger individuals required more potent combinations that would render them unconscious before causing death. Wealthy merchants who might be carrying significant amounts of money received special attention, with Martha sometimes extending their suffering for hours or even days while the family extracted information about the location of hidden valuables. The cellar beneath the Blackwood farmhouse had been expanded significantly since Harold Gaines's burial. Ezra and Samuel had spent the winter months digging additional chambers and storage areas, creating what amounted to an underground complex that could accommodate dozens of bodies while maintaining the appearance of a normal root cellar to any casual observer who might have occasion to venture downstairs. The expansion project had also provided father and son with opportunities for extended conversations about human nature, survival, and the moral compromises that were sometimes necessary for protecting one's family. Ezra shared stories from his military service, describing how war had taught him that killing could become routine, even comfortable, when it served a greater purpose. Samuel listened to these lessons with intense interest, understanding that his father was providing him with a philosophical framework for justifying what their family had become. People like to believe that everyone is fundamentally good, Ezra explained while they worked together to dig graves for 3 travelers who had made the mistake of stopping at the boarding house during a particularly profitable week in March. But the war taught me that goodness is a luxury most folks can't afford when their survival is at stake. We're not different from other families. We're just more honest about what it takes to protect what's ours. Samuel accepted this worldview completely, but he also began developing ideas of his own about how their family's activities could be expanded and improved. During the long winter evenings, he would sit with his father and discuss potential modifications to their methods, ways of attracting more valuable targets, and strategies for avoiding the attention of law enforcement officials who might eventually begin noticing patterns in the disappearances of travelers along the Missouri River route. Rebecca's contributions to the family enterprise were more subtle but equally important. She had become expert at reading the emotional states of their victims, understanding exactly when fear would begin to overcome trust, and timing her parents' actions to ensure that victims were eliminated before they could become suspicious or attempt to escape. She also managed the practical aspects of disposing of personal belongings, carefully sorting through victims' possessions to identify items that could be sold safely and those that needed to be destroyed to avoid creating evidence. But Rebecca had also begun experiencing something that her parents and brother did not seem to share. While the rest of her family approached their killing with clinical efficiency, Rebecca found herself genuinely enjoying the process of watching people die. She had started requesting permission to be present during the final moments of particularly interesting victims, studying their faces as consciousness faded and taking detailed mental notes about the differences between various types of death. Martha had noticed her daughter's fascination, but chose to interpret it as intellectual curiosity rather than something more disturbing. The entire family had adapted to circumstances that would have destroyed most people's moral foundations, and Martha told herself that Rebecca's intensity was simply another form of the strength that had allowed all of them to survive and prosper in their challenging environment. The spring of 1872 brought an unusual run of wealthy travelers to the Blackwood boarding house. Word of their exceptional hospitality had spread throughout the region, attracting exactly the kind of well-funded guests that the family preferred to target. During a 3-week period in April, 7 different travelers stayed with the Blackwoods, and none of them continued their journeys. The first was Marcus Whitfield, a cattle trader from Texas carrying nearly $800 in gold coins and banknotes. Whitfield was a careful man who had survived years of dangerous business dealings by maintaining appropriate suspicion of strangers. But Martha's performance of motherly concern gradually convinced him that the Blackwood family represented the kind of simple, honest folk that still existed in the world, despite the corruption he had encountered in larger cities. Whitfield's elimination required more sophisticated planning than usual. He was physically strong, mentally alert, and had mentioned during dinner conversation that he expected to meet business associates in Kansas City within the week. Martha realized that a quick death would not provide sufficient time to extract information about the location of his money, while a delayed death would create timeline problems when his associates began looking for him. The solution came from Samuel, who suggested that they should make Whitfield believe he was suffering from a genuine illness that would require extended rest before he could safely continue traveling. Martha prepared a combination of herbs that would create symptoms resembling cholera, a disease that travelers feared enough to justify remaining in quarantine for several weeks while recovering. Over the course of 10 days, Martha carefully managed Whitfield's condition, alternating between treatments that seemed to improve his health and others that caused relapses severe enough to prevent him from leaving. During his lucid periods, the family extracted detailed information about his business dealings, the location of his money, and his planned schedule in Kansas City. When they had learned everything useful, Martha administered a final dose that ended Whitfield's suffering permanently. The success of the extended approach convinced the family that they had discovered a method that could be applied to particularly valuable victims. Rather than killing quickly and risking the loss of potentially valuable information, they could create circumstances that justified keeping victims alive and accessible for whatever time period might be necessary to maximize profit from each death. Thomas Bergen, a land speculator from Illinois, became their next extended victim. Bergen was traveling with detailed maps of available properties, contracts for several potentially lucrative deals, and most importantly, information about investors who had provided him with substantial funds to purchase specific tracts of land. The family spent 3 weeks extracting information from Bergen, while maintaining the fiction that he was recovering from a severe respiratory ailment that would prove fatal if he attempted to travel before completing his treatment. Bergen's death was followed by those of Sarah and Michael Harrison, a married couple who had sold their farm in Ohio and were carrying the proceeds west to purchase land in California. The Harrisons represented a new challenge for the family, since killing a married couple required careful attention to preventing either spouse from becoming suspicious about the other's condition. Martha solved this problem by convincing each spouse that they were both suffering from the same illness, creating a situation where each patient was concerned primarily with their partner's welfare rather than questioning their own treatment. But the most significant development during this period was not the increasing sophistication of the family's methods, but the growing involvement of Samuel and Rebecca in the actual process of killing. Both children had begun requesting permission to take more active roles in eliminating victims, arguing that they were now old enough to contribute meaningfully to the family's survival and prosperity. Samuel's first kill was Jacob Morrison, a young traveling salesman who had been staying with the family for less than 48 hours when he made the mistake of becoming romantically interested in Rebecca. Morrison's attention to Rebecca created a situation where he was paying too much attention to the family's daily routines and asking too many questions about their other guests and their business operations. Martha decided that Morrison needed to be eliminated quickly, but she also recognized that the situation provided an excellent opportunity for Samuel to gain experience in killing. Under his mother's guidance, Samuel prepared a mixture of herbs that would cause Morrison to lose consciousness gradually, allowing Samuel to observe the victim's responses and make adjustments to the dosage as necessary. Samuel's reaction to causing Morrison's death surprised even his parents. Rather than showing signs of emotional distress or moral conflict, Samuel approached the killing with the same methodical efficiency that he applied to farm work or household chores. He monitored Morrison's declining condition with scientific interest, taking mental notes about the effectiveness of different herb combinations and making suggestions for future improvements to their methods. Rebecca's first kill came 2 weeks later, when an elderly traveling preacher named Reverend James Whitcomb arrived at the boarding house, carrying what appeared to be a substantial donation from his congregation for establishing a new church in Kansas City. Whitcomb was a gentleman who spent his first evening with the family reading scripture aloud and discussing theological questions with apparent genuine interest in their spiritual welfare. Martha assigned the responsibility for Whitcomb's death to Rebecca, partly to provide her daughter with necessary experience, but also to test Rebecca's ability to eliminate someone who represented everything their family claimed to respect and honor. If Rebecca could kill a preacher without hesitation or regret, Martha would know that her daughter possessed the emotional strength necessary to survive in the world they had created. Rebecca's approach to killing Reverend Whitcomb demonstrated a level of psychological sophistication that disturbed even her parents. Rather than simply poisoning the old man's food, Rebecca spent several days engaging him in theological conversations about sin, forgiveness, and the possibility of redemption for people who had committed terrible acts. She appeared genuinely interested in Whitcomb's responses, asking detailed questions about biblical interpretation and moral philosophy. On Whitcomb's final evening alive, Rebecca prepared his dinner with special care, including herbs that would cause gradual paralysis while leaving his mind completely clear. As the preacher realized what was happening to him, Rebecca sat beside his chair and continued their theological discussion, asking whether he still believed in divine forgiveness now that he was experiencing the reality of human evil firsthand. "Do you think God will forgive me for this?" Rebecca asked, as Whitcomb struggled to speak despite his failing respiratory system. "Or do you think some sins are too terrible for redemption?" Whitcomb's attempts to respond became increasingly desperate as his condition worsened, but Rebecca continued her questioning until the old man finally died. Martha and Ezra, watching from the kitchen doorway, realized that their daughter had developed capabilities that exceeded their own, both in terms of tactical sophistication and psychological ruthlessness. By summer 1872, the Blackwood family had killed 23 people, accumulated wealth that exceeded the annual income of most Missouri farmers, and developed a system of predation that could potentially continue indefinitely without detection. They had also begun to understand that their activities were changing them in ways that went beyond simple moral compromise. Martha found herself studying potential victims with the analytical detachment that she had once reserved for evaluating livestock at market. She could assess a stranger's value as a target within minutes of conversation, calculating not only their probable wealth, but also the risks associated with their disappearance and the most efficient methods for extracting maximum benefit from their death. Ezra had discovered that killing had become not just routine, but genuinely satisfying in ways that his military service had never provided. Unlike warfare, where death served abstract political purposes that he didn't fully understand, the family's killing served immediate, practical goals that benefited people he actually cared about. Each victim's death directly improved his family's security and prosperity, creating a direct causal relationship between violence and positive outcomes that made each subsequent killing easier to justify and enjoy. But it was Samuel and Rebecca who had been most thoroughly transformed by their family's activities. Both children now viewed other human beings primarily as potential sources of income. evaluating everyone they encountered for their suitability as victims. They had learned to simulate normal emotions and social responses when interacting with people outside their family. But these performances were based on calculated assessment of what responses would be most effective, rather than genuine feelings or moral concerns. Samuel had begun developing ideas for expanding their operation beyond the boarding house itself. He envisioned a network of similar enterprises throughout the Missouri Territory, with family members or trusted associates operating additional locations that could capture travelers along multiple routes. He also suggested that they might be able to collaborate with other criminals, providing specialized services to people who needed specific individuals eliminated for personal or business reasons. Rebecca's interest had moved beyond simple killing toward more complex forms of psychological experimentation. She had begun requesting permission to keep certain victims alive for extended periods, not for the practical purpose of extracting information, but to study their emotional and physical responses to prolonged captivity and torture. She wanted to understand how hope and despair affected people's behavior, how long victims could maintain sanity under various forms of stress, and whether it was possible to break someone's will completely while keeping them alive indefinitely. Martha and Ezra gradually came to understand that their children had developed capabilities and interests that might eventually exceed their parents' ability to control or direct. Both Samuel and Rebecca had begun making suggestions that went far beyond the family's current activities, proposing methods and experiments that would require significantly more risk and would attract the kind of attention that could destroy their carefully maintained facade of respectability. But the wealth and security that their criminal activities had provided made it difficult to consider returning to legitimate business operations. The family had become accustomed to a standard of living that far exceeded what they could achieve through farming or operating an honest boarding house, and they had also discovered psychological rewards in their criminal activities that legitimate work could never provide. As the summer of 1872 progressed, the Blackwood family prepared for what they expected would be their most profitable season yet. Travel was increasing as the region recovered from the economic disruptions of the Civil War, and their reputation for hospitality continued to attract exactly the kind of wealthy, isolated travelers who made ideal victims. They had developed methods that virtually guaranteed success, accumulated experience that allowed them to handle any complications that might arise, and created an operational security that appeared to make detection almost impossible. What they had not anticipated was that their success would eventually attract the attention of people who were not potential victims, but potential threats. Law enforcement officials in Kansas City had begun to notice that unusually large numbers of travelers were failing to arrive at their intended destinations, and several of these missing persons had last been seen traveling along the Missouri River route where the Blackwood boarding house was located. Federal marshals had also become interested in reports of missing persons, since many of the disappeared travelers had been carrying mail or packages that represented federal jurisdiction when they failed to reach their destinations. The investigation was still in its preliminary stages, but experienced investigators were beginning to focus their attention on the area around Independence, Missouri, and they were asking questions about local businesses that catered to travelers. The Blackwood family's perfect system was about to encounter the first serious challenge to its continued operation, and the outcome would determine whether they could adapt their methods to avoid detection, or whether their reign of terror along the Missouri River would finally come to an end. But by this point, Martha, Ezra, Samuel, and Rebecca had become so thoroughly committed to their criminal lifestyle that returning to legitimate activities was no longer a realistic option. They had discovered that killing could be not only profitable, but deeply satisfying, and they had developed capabilities that they were eager to continue using and improving. The approaching investigation represented not just a threat to their security, but a challenge to their identity as predators who had successfully operated beyond the reach of law and conventional morality. The family began preparing for the possibility that they might need to defend their operation through violence, or alternatively, that they might need to abandon their current location and establish themselves elsewhere under new identities. But they also began considering a third option that none of them had previously discussed openly: the possibility that they could eliminate the threat permanently by targeting the investigators themselves. Samuels, in particular, had begun researching the identities and habits of the federal marshals who were asking questions in Kansas City. He believed that killing one or two investigators would demonstrate that the Missouri River route was too dangerous for continued law enforcement attention, while also providing the family with valuable experience in eliminating victims who were trained to be suspicious and cautious. Rebecca supported her brother's proposal, arguing that federal marshals would likely be carrying more money than typical travelers, and that their deaths would also provide opportunities for studying how law enforcement training affected people's responses to captivity and torture. She was particularly interested in determining whether professional experience with violence and death would make investigators more or less susceptible to psychological manipulation during extended captivity. As autumn approached, the Blackwood family was evolving from opportunistic killers who targeted vulnerable travelers into something far more dangerous: systematic predators who were prepared to wage war against law enforcement itself, rather than abandon their profitable criminal enterprise. The transformation that had begun with Harold Gaines's death was approaching its logical conclusion, and the results would soon shake the Missouri Territory to its foundations. The investigation that would ultimately expose the Blackwood family began not with law enforcement officials, but with a private detective named Jonas Carmichael, whose missing brother had last been seen traveling toward Independence, Missouri, in the summer of 1872. William Carmichael had been a successful grain merchant from Illinois, who had written to his brother about plans to establish trading relationships with farmers along the Missouri River, but his correspondence had stopped abruptly in July, and he had never arrived at his intended destination in Kansas City. Jonas Carmichael was a methodical man who had spent 15 years working for the Pinkerton Detective Agency before establishing his own private investigation practice. His experience had taught him to recognize patterns that local law enforcement often missed, and he had developed techniques for gathering information that went far beyond traditional police methods. When William Carmichael failed to respond to multiple telegrams and letters, Jonas decided to retrace his brother's planned route personally, asking questions at every business and settlement between Illinois and Kansas City. The investigation led Carmichael to the Blackwood boarding house in early September 1872. Exactly 3 weeks after William's last known communication, Jonas presented himself as a traveling journalist researching business opportunities along the Missouri River, claiming to be particularly interested in establishments that catered to merchants and traders. His cover story was designed to encourage detailed conversation about recent guests and business trends, while appearing to be nothing more than routine commercial research. Martha Blackwood received Jonas Carmichael with her characteristic warmth and hospitality, preparing an elaborate dinner and engaging him in extensive conversation about the region's economic development and growth prospects. She described the boarding house's success in attracting travelers from throughout the Midwest, mentioning specific examples of recent guests who had praised their accommodations and recommended their services to associates. But Carmichael's trained eye noticed details that would have escaped casual observation. Martha's descriptions of recent guests included unusually precise information about their personal backgrounds, business dealings, and financial circumstances, the kind of detailed knowledge that would be difficult to acquire through normal social conversation. The boarding house itself showed signs of recent improvements and renovations that would have required substantial capital investment, far more than a rural boarding house would typically generate through legitimate operations. Most significantly, Carmichael observed the behavior of Samuel and Rebecca Blackwood, both of whom displayed an intensity and sophistication that seemed inappropriate for teenagers who had spent their entire lives in rural Missouri. Samuel's questions about Carmichael's journalism work revealed knowledge of investigative techniques and information-gathering methods that would be unusual for someone without professional training or extensive education. Rebecca's observations about human behavior and psychology suggested familiarity with concepts that most adults would find difficult to understand or articulate. During his first evening at the boarding house, Carmichael excused himself early, claiming exhaustion from his travels, but actually using the time to conduct a thorough search of the property. His investigation revealed several disturbing anomalies, including fresh excavation work in the cellar, unusual amounts of personal belongings stored in various outbuildings, and evidence of recent construction projects that had no apparent practical purpose for legitimate boarding house operations. Carmichael also discovered something that confirmed his worst suspicions about the Blackwood family. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in one of the storage rooms, he found a collection of personal items that included his brother's distinctive gold pocket watch, along with jewelry, money, and documents that clearly belonged to multiple different individuals. The collection represented far more wealth than any rural family could legitimately accumulate, and several of the items showed signs of having been taken from their owners under violent circumstances. The detective realized that he was staying with a family of murderers who had been systematically killing travelers for over a year. But he also understood that he was now in extreme personal danger, since his investigative activities would eventually be discovered, and the Blackwood family would certainly attempt to eliminate him, as they had eliminated dozens of previous victims. Carmichael's military training during the Civil War had prepared him for dangerous situations, and his detective work had taught him to recognize when immediate action was necessary, rather than waiting for additional evidence or law enforcement support. He decided to attempt gathering additional information about the extent of the Blackwood family's crimes, while simultaneously preparing to defend himself against almost certain attack. The following morning, Carmichael engaged Martha Blackwood in casual conversation about local business conditions, asking whether she had noticed any changes in the patterns of travelers along the Missouri River route. Martha's responses revealed that she possessed extraordinarily detailed knowledge about the movements and activities of people who had supposedly been passing through the area temporarily, including specific information about business dealings, personal relationships, and financial circumstances that would be impossible to learn through brief interactions with legitimate guests. It seems like fewer merchants have been continuing on to Kansas City lately, Carmichael observed carefully, watching Martha's reaction. I've heard several people in town mention that travelers who were expected to arrive for business meetings never showed up. Martha's expression remained neutral, but Carmichael noticed a slight tension in her posture that suggested his comment had struck closer to the truth than she found comfortable. Well, the roads have been difficult this summer, she replied. Maybe folks decided to wait for better traveling conditions, or found opportunities closer to home. But Martha's explanation did not account for the wealth of personal belongings that Carmichael had discovered, or for the clear evidence of recent deaths that he had observed in the cellar. He realized that Martha was maintaining her performance of innocent hospitality, even while understanding that her family's activities had been discovered. Samuel and Rebecca Blackwood had also become increasingly attentive to Carmichael's activities and conversations. Both children positioned themselves where they could observe his movements throughout the day, and their questions about his journalism work became more probing and specific. Rebecca, in particular, seemed to be evaluating Carmichael with the analytical interest that a predator might show toward potential prey. You ask a lot of questions about people's business, Rebecca observed during their second evening together. Most travelers just want to rest and eat before continuing their journeys, but you seem really interested in learning about everyone who's stayed here recently. Carmichael recognized that Rebecca's comment was not casual conversation, but a direct challenge to his cover story. The girl was testing him to determine whether he represented a threat to her family's operations, and his response would likely determine whether he survived the night. I suppose journalists do tend to be curious about people and stories, Carmichael replied carefully. It helps me write more interesting articles about the places I visit and the people I meet. Rebecca studied his face with an intensity that was deeply disturbing in someone so young. What kind of articles are you planning to write about us? She asked. The question carried implications that went far beyond simple curiosity about media coverage. Carmichael realized that Rebecca was actually asking whether he intended to expose her family's activities, and that his answer would determine how the Blackwood family would handle his continued presence at their boarding house. That evening, Carmichael made preparations for what he expected would be an attempt on his life. He barricaded his door using furniture from his room, positioned his pistol where it would be easily accessible, and prepared written documentation of his discoveries to be found by investigators if he did not survive the night. He also spent considerable time examining the layout of the boarding house and identifying potential escape routes if the situation required immediate departure. Martha Blackwood's attempt to poison Carmichael's breakfast the following morning confirmed that the family had decided to eliminate him permanently. But Carmichael's detective training had made him cautious about accepting food or drink from people he suspected of criminal activity, and he had been carefully avoiding consumption of anything prepared by the Blackwood family since his first evening at the boarding house. When Martha noticed that Carmichael was not eating the specially prepared breakfast, she began applying increased pressure, expressing concern about his health and insisting that he needed proper nutrition to maintain his strength for continued traveling. Her maternal performance became increasingly forced and artificial as Carmichael continued to decline her offerings. making it clear that both parties understood exactly what was happening, despite the facade of normal social interaction. "You really should eat something substantial before you continue your journey," Martha insisted, her voice carrying undertones that suggested refusal was not acceptable. "The roads ahead are difficult, and you'll need your strength." Samuel and Ezra Blackwood had positioned themselves strategically around the kitchen, blocking potential escape routes and clearly preparing for physical confrontation if Carmichael continued to resist their mother's hospitality. The family's coordination and tactical positioning revealed that they had extensive experience in handling situations where potential victims became suspicious or uncooperative. Carmichael realized that his attempts to avoid consuming poisoned food had created a standoff that could only end in violence. The Blackwood family could not allow him to leave alive with knowledge of their activities, and he could not survive a direct confrontation against 4 people who were fighting to protect a criminal enterprise that represented their primary source of income and security. The confrontation began when Samuel Blackwood attempted to force Carmichael to consume the poisoned breakfast by holding him down while Martha administered the deadly herbs directly. But Carmichael's military and detective experience had prepared him for hand-to-hand combat, and he was able to break free from Samuel's restraint while drawing his pistol simultaneously. The gun battle that followed was brief, but devastating. Carmichael's first shot caught Samuel in the chest, killing him instantly and creating a moment of shock that allowed the detective to gain tactical advantage over the remaining family members. Ezra Blackwood, despite his military background, had not been prepared for facing an armed opponent who understood their intentions and had prepared accordingly. Martha and Rebecca attempted to escape through the back door of the boarding house, but Carmichael pursued them. Knowing that allowing any family member to survive would result in immediate danger to himself and potential warning to other criminal associates who might be operating similar enterprises elsewhere in the region. The chase ended in the woods behind the boarding house, where Martha Blackwood made a final attempt to negotiate for her life and her daughter's survival. She offered to provide Carmichael with detailed information about their victims, the location of stolen money and valuables, and the methods they had developed for avoiding detection by law enforcement officials. "We can help you understand how we did this," Martha pleaded desperately. "There might be others operating the same way, and you could use our knowledge to find them. Rebecca and I could work with you to identify other criminal families." But Carmichael understood that Martha's offers were tactical maneuvers designed to create opportunities for escape or counterattack, rather than genuine attempts at cooperation. His detective experience had taught him that criminals would say anything to avoid immediate consequences for their actions, and that allowing dangerous individuals to survive often resulted in additional victims and complications for ongoing investigations. Martha and Rebecca Blackwood were killed approximately 1 hour after the confrontation began, bringing an end to one of the most systematic and successful criminal enterprises in Missouri Territory history. But Carmichael's victory came at a cost that he had not anticipated, since the deaths of the entire family meant that crucial information about their methods and potential associates would be lost forever. When Carmichael finally felt safe enough to conduct a thorough search of the Blackwood property, the scope of the family's crimes exceeded even his worst expectations. The cellar beneath the boarding house contained the remains of 47 different individuals, along with detailed records documenting each victim's personal information, the methods used to kill them, and the financial benefits derived from their deaths. Martha Blackwood had maintained meticulous journals describing the family's criminal activities, recording not only practical information about their methods and victims, but also psychological observations about the effects of different killing techniques and philosophical reflections about the nature of morality and human behavior. The journals revealed that the family's crimes had evolved from opportunistic murders committed for financial gain into sophisticated psychological experiments designed to satisfy intellectual curiosity about human suffering and death. Samuel and Rebecca's personal belongings included drawings and written descriptions of torture techniques, plans for expanding their criminal operations beyond the boarding house itself, and correspondence with individuals who might have been collaborators or customers for specialized killing services. The evidence suggested that the Blackwood family had been developing connections with other criminals throughout the region, creating what amounted to an organized network of predators who shared information and resources. Most disturbing were Rebecca's detailed notes documenting her personal experiences with killing and torture, written in the analytical style of someone conducting scientific research rather than someone committing violent crimes. Her observations about victim psychology, the effects of different types of physical and emotional trauma, and the optimization of suffering suggested that she had viewed murder not as a means to an end, but as an end in itself. Each person responds differently to the realization that they are going to die. One of Rebecca's entries observed, "Some become angry, some become desperate, some become resigned, but the most interesting ones become curious. They want to understand why this is happening to them, and they start asking questions about our motivations and methods. Those are the ones worth keeping alive for extended periods." Carmichael spent 3 days cataloging the evidence at the Blackwood property before traveling to Kansas City to report his findings to federal authorities. His investigation had not only solved the mystery of his brother's disappearance, but had also uncovered one of the most extensive criminal enterprises in American history, a family operation that had successfully killed dozens of people while maintaining a reputation for hospitality and Christian virtue. The federal investigation that followed Carmichael's report revealed that the Blackwood family's activities were part of a larger pattern of crimes being committed by rural families throughout the Midwest. Several other boarding houses, inns, and private residences had been operated by criminals who targeted traveling merchants, settlers, and other individuals who carried substantial amounts of money or valuables while traveling alone through sparsely populated areas. But the Blackwood case stood out from these other criminal enterprises because of the systematic nature of the family's activities and the sophisticated methods they had developed for avoiding detection. Most rural criminals were opportunistic and disorganized, killing victims impulsively and disposing of evidence carelessly. The Blackwoods had approached murder as a business enterprise, developing efficient methods, maintaining detailed records, and continuously improving their techniques based on experience and observation. The psychological aspects of the case also attracted attention from medical professionals and academic researchers who were beginning to develop theories about criminal behavior and mental illness. The detailed journals kept by Martha, Samuel, and Rebecca Blackwood provided unprecedented insight into the thought processes and motivations of systematic killers, revealing patterns of reasoning and emotional response that challenged prevailing assumptions about human nature and moral development. Dr. Elias Morrison, a prominent alienist from St. Louis who examined the Blackwood family's journals and personal effects, concluded that all 4 family members had displayed characteristics that would later be recognized as antisocial personality disorder, but which were essentially unknown to medical science in the 1870s. Morrison's report noted that the family's crimes appeared to have been motivated not simply by greed or desperation, but by genuine psychological gratification derived from the exercise of complete power over other human beings. The Blackwood family represents something unprecedented in my professional experience, Dr. Morrison wrote in his official analysis. They appear to have developed a form of shared psychosis in which normal moral constraints were gradually eliminated through mutual reinforcement of antisocial attitudes and behaviors. Each family member contributed to the other's psychological deterioration, creating a situation where extremely dangerous criminal activities became not only acceptable, but deeply satisfying to everyone involved. The investigation also revealed that the Blackwood family's crimes had been enabled by social and economic conditions that made their victims particularly vulnerable to predation. The post-Civil War period had created large numbers of displaced persons who traveled alone through unfamiliar territories, carrying substantial amounts of money or valuables, with limited connections to people who would notice their disappearance quickly enough to trigger effective searches. Rural families like the Blackwoods occupied positions of trust and respectability that made them unlikely suspects when travelers disappeared, while the scattered nature of frontier settlements made it difficult for law enforcement officials to recognize patterns of crime or coordinate investigative efforts across multiple jurisdictions. But the most chilling aspect of the Blackwood case was the realization that their success might have inspired similar criminal enterprises elsewhere, and that dozens of other families throughout the American frontier might be operating comparable operations without detection. The methods developed by the Blackwoods could be replicated by any rural family with sufficient intelligence and ruthlessness, creating the potential for hundreds of similar criminal enterprises throughout the rapidly expanding Western territories. Jonas Carmichael's private investigation had uncovered not just a single criminal family, but evidence of what might be a widespread phenomenon of systematic predation against travelers throughout the American Midwest. The implications were too disturbing for most people to contemplate directly. forcing a recognition that the frontier hospitality and Christian charity that many Americans believed characterized rural communities might, in some cases, be elaborate facades concealing unprecedented levels of organized violence and exploitation. The Blackwood boarding house was demolished by federal authorities in the winter of 1873, and the property was sold to developers who had no knowledge of its history. But local residents avoided the area for decades afterward, creating persistent legends about cursed ground and restless spirits that reflected the community's collective trauma from learning that they had been living in proximity to such systematic evil for over 2 years. The case files from the Blackwood investigation remained sealed by federal authorities for nearly 50 years, released only to qualified researchers who could demonstrate legitimate academic interest in the development of criminal psychology and law enforcement techniques. Even today, the complete details of the family's crimes and methods are not widely known outside of academic and law enforcement circles, partly because of concerns about inspiring copycat crimes and partly because the psychological aspects of the case continue to challenge comfortable assumptions about human nature and moral development. The aftermath of Jonas Carmichael's investigation into the Blackwood family murders created ripple effects that transformed law enforcement practices, criminal psychology research, and social attitudes throughout the American frontier for decades to come. The case established precedents for federal intervention in local criminal matters, demonstrated the need for coordinated investigative techniques across multiple jurisdictions, and provided the first systematic documentation of what would eventually be recognized as organized family-based criminal enterprises. Federal Marshal Robert Hayes, who supervised the official investigation following Carmichael's report, spent 6 months cataloging evidence and interviewing residents throughout the Missouri River region. Hayes discovered that the Blackwood family's criminal activities had been far more extensive than even Carmichael had realized, with connections to similar operations in at least 3 other states and evidence of a sophisticated communication network that allowed rural criminal families to share information about potential targets and law enforcement activities. The Marshal's investigation revealed that Martha Blackwood had maintained correspondence with criminal associates in Illinois, Kansas, and Arkansas, exchanging detailed information about successful killing techniques, victim selection strategies, and methods for avoiding detection by local authorities. These letters, discovered hidden in various locations throughout the Blackwood property, provided evidence that systematic predation against travelers was occurring on a much larger scale than anyone had previously suspected. One letter from a woman named Sarah Collins in Arkansas described her family's successful operation of a way station that had been killing travelers for over 3 years, using methods remarkably similar to those developed by the Blackwoods. Collins wrote about the challenges of disposing of evidence in areas with active law enforcement presence, strategies for identifying travelers who carried substantial amounts of money, and techniques for maintaining community respectability while conducting systematic murder. "The key is never getting greedy," Collins advised in one letter. "Take too many people too quickly, and folks start noticing patterns. But space things out proper, vary your methods, and make sure the bodies never get found, and you can keep this going indefinitely. We've cleared nearly $2,000 this year alone, and nobody suspects anything." Another correspondent, identifying himself only as J. Morrison from Kansas, described a family operation that targeted not just individual travelers, but entire wagon trains passing through sparsely populated areas. Morrison's letters detailed ambush techniques that allowed small groups of attackers to overcome larger numbers of victims, methods for disposing of wagons and livestock without leaving evidence, and strategies for selling stolen goods in distant markets where their origins would not be recognized. The scope of these criminal networks shocked federal investigators and led to the first coordinated multi-state law enforcement operation in American history. Over the course of 2 years, federal marshals and local authorities identified and investigated more than 30 rural families suspected of operating systematic killing enterprises similar to the Blackwood operation. The results were devastating for frontier communities throughout the Midwest. Families that had been respected members of their communities for decades were revealed to be sophisticated criminal enterprises responsible for hundreds of deaths. The investigation uncovered mass graves containing the remains of travelers, settlers, and merchants who had disappeared while crossing the American frontier, revealing that the dangers of westward expansion had been far greater than most people had realized. Dr. Elias Morrison's psychological analysis of the confiscated correspondence and journals from these criminal families provided the foundation for academic understanding of what would eventually be called organized criminal behavior and antisocial personality disorder. Morrison's research revealed that successful criminal families typically developed shared value systems that gradually replaced conventional moral frameworks, creating situations where systematic murder became not only acceptable, but psychologically rewarding for all family members involved. These families did not begin as monsters, Dr. Morrison wrote in his influential 1875 study. They were ordinary people who made initial moral compromises under economic pressure, then discovered that criminal activity provided both financial benefits and psychological satisfactions that legitimate work could not match. Over time, the entire family structure became oriented around criminal activity, with traditional moral constraints gradually eliminated through mutual reinforcement of antisocial attitudes. Morrison's research also revealed disturbing patterns in the development of criminal family enterprises. Children raised in these environments typically displayed remarkable intelligence and social skills, but completely lacked normal empathy and moral reasoning abilities. They learned to simulate appropriate emotional responses for social situations, but experienced genuine satisfaction only when exercising complete power over other human beings. The long-term implications of these discoveries extended far beyond law enforcement concerns. Religious leaders throughout the frontier region struggled to reconcile the existence of such systematic evil with their theological understanding of human nature and divine providence. If entire families could become organized predators while maintaining facades of Christian respectability, traditional assumptions about moral development and community trust required fundamental reconsideration. Reverend Michael Patterson, whose congregation in Independence, Missouri, had included several families later revealed to be criminal enterprises, spent years grappling with the theological implications of the discoveries. His sermons from this period, preserved in church archives there, reveal a man attempting to understand how systematic evil could flourish within communities that considered themselves fundamentally Christian and morally upright. We must ask ourselves whether evil is something that happens to people, or something that lives within all of us, waiting for the right circumstances to reveal itself, Reverend Patterson wrote in 1874. The families we have discovered among us were not strangers or outsiders. They were our neighbors, people we trusted, individuals who appeared to share our values and our faith. If we failed to recognize such profound evil in people we saw regularly, what does that suggest about our ability to understand human nature or protect ourselves from similar deceptions in the future? The social and economic consequences of the investigation were equally profound. Travel along frontier routes decreased dramatically as news of the criminal families spread throughout the region. Merchants and settlers became reluctant to stop at rural inns or boarding houses, preferring to camp in the open rather than risk encountering predatory families. The hospitality industry throughout the Midwest suffered severe economic damage as potential customers chose to avoid any situation that might leave them vulnerable to attack. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the Blackwood case was its influence on the development of modern criminal investigation techniques. Jonas Carmichael's private investigation had demonstrated the importance of systematic evidence gathering, psychological profiling of suspected criminals, and coordination between different law enforcement agencies. His methods became standard practice for federal investigators, and his written reports on the case were used as training materials for law enforcement professionals throughout the United States. The case also highlighted the importance of understanding criminal psychology in developing effective investigative strategies. Traditional law enforcement approaches, which focused primarily on identifying and apprehending individual criminals after specific crimes had been committed, proved inadequate for dealing with sophisticated criminal enterprises that operated continuously over extended periods while maintaining facades of respectability. Federal authorities developed new approaches that emphasized pattern recognition, long-term surveillance, and systematic analysis of financial and social relationships that might indicate criminal activity. These techniques, first developed for investigating rural criminal families, eventually became standard practice for dealing with all forms of organized criminal enterprises. The Blackwood property itself became a site of continued investigation and research for decades after the family's deaths. Archaeological excavations conducted in the 1880s and 1890s revealed additional burial sites containing the remains of victims who had never been documented in the family's journals, suggesting that their criminal activities had been even more extensive than the official investigation had determined. Researchers from several universities studied the site to better understand the logistics of operating systematic killing enterprises in rural settings. Their findings provided valuable insights into the methods used by criminal families to avoid detection, the techniques they employed for disposing of evidence, and the psychological and social factors that enabled such enterprises to operate successfully for extended periods. The cellar complex beneath the Blackwood boarding house became a particular focus of academic interest. Engineering studies revealed that the excavation and construction work required to create the underground burial chambers would have taken months of careful planning and implementation, demonstrating the long-term commitment and sophisticated planning that the family had devoted to their criminal activities. Personal artifacts recovered from the burial sites provided additional insight into the family's victim selection strategies and killing methods. Analysis of jewelry, clothing, and personal effects revealed that the Blackwoods had targeted individuals from a wide range of social and economic backgrounds, suggesting that their criteria for selecting victims were based more on vulnerability and opportunity than on the potential financial benefits of specific murders. Dr. Morrison's continued research into the psychological aspects of the case led to groundbreaking insights into the development of antisocial behavior and the role of family dynamics in shaping criminal attitudes. His work with the surviving documentation from multiple criminal families revealed consistent patterns in how normal family structures could be transformed into organized criminal enterprises under specific social and economic pressures. The frontier environment created unique conditions that enabled these criminal families to thrive. Dr. Morrison concluded in his final report on the investigation, the combination of social isolation, economic uncertainty, limited law enforcement presence, and abundant opportunities to prey on vulnerable travelers created a perfect environment for the development of systematic predatory behavior. Morrison's research also revealed that criminal families typically developed their own internal moral systems that justified their activities and maintained group cohesion, despite engaging in behaviors that violated all conventional ethical standards. These alternative value systems often incorporated elements of social Darwinism, religious fatalism, and economic pragmatism to create philosophical frameworks that portrayed systematic murder as not only acceptable, but morally superior to the economic struggles and social constraints experienced by law-abiding families. The academic and law enforcement insights generated by the Blackwood investigation continued to influence criminal justice practices well into the 20th century. The case provided the foundation for modern understanding of organized crime, family-based criminal enterprises, and the psychological factors that enable individuals to commit systematic violence while maintaining facades of social respectability. But the most profound legacy of the Blackwood case may be its impact on American cultural attitudes toward frontier hospitality and community trust. The discovery that systematic predators had been operating successfully within rural communities for years while maintaining reputations for Christian charity and neighborly assistance forced a fundamental reconsideration of assumptions about human nature and social relationships that had been central to frontier culture. The idealized vision of frontier communities as places where neighbors helped each other survive harsh conditions and where Christian values provided moral guidance for social interactions was permanently shattered by the realization that some of the most respected families in these communities had actually been sophisticated predators who viewed their neighbors primarily as potential victims. This cultural transformation had lasting effects on American social development. The casual trust and open hospitality that had characterized frontier communities gave way to increased suspicion and more formal social structures designed to provide protection against deception and exploitation. The frontier period's emphasis on individual self-reliance and community mutual assistance was replaced by growing reliance on institutional authorities and professional law enforcement for protection against criminal threats. The Blackwood case also influenced American literature and popular culture for decades to come. The story of a seemingly respectable family that systematically murdered travelers while maintaining a facade of Christian hospitality became a recurring theme in novels, plays, and eventually films that explored the dark side of American expansion and the potential for evil to flourish beneath appearances of respectability and virtue. Writers like Ambrose Bierce and later Edgar Allan Poe drew inspiration from the psychological aspects of the case, creating fictional works that examined the mental processes of individuals who could commit systematic murder while maintaining normal social relationships. These literary treatments helped establish a cultural understanding that evil was not always obviously monstrous, but could take forms that were difficult to recognize until it was too late to avoid becoming a victim. The case continues to influence academic research into criminal psychology, organized crime, and the social factors that enable systematic violence to flourish within apparently normal communities. Modern researchers study the Blackwood family documents and investigative records to better understand how criminal enterprises develop and maintain themselves over extended periods, and how communities can protect themselves against sophisticated predatory behavior. Contemporary law enforcement agencies still use investigative techniques and psychological profiling methods that were first developed during the investigation of rural criminal families in the 1870s. The recognition that systematic criminals often maintain facades of respectability while conducting their illegal activities has become a fundamental principle of modern criminal investigation, influencing approaches to everything from organized crime to domestic terrorism. The story of the Blackwood family represents a dark chapter in American history that challenges comfortable assumptions about human nature, community trust, and moral development. Their systematic murder of dozens of travelers while maintaining reputations as upstanding Christian citizens reveals the potential for evil to flourish in circumstances where social isolation, economic pressure, and limited law enforcement oversight create opportunities for predatory behavior. The case demonstrates that evil rarely announces itself obviously, but more often operates behind masks of respectability and virtue, making it difficult for potential victims to recognize danger until they have already placed themselves in vulnerable positions. The Blackwood family's success in maintaining their criminal enterprise for over 2 years, while operating as a respected business within their community, illustrates how sophisticated predators can exploit social conventions and cultural expectations to create opportunities for systematic victimization. Perhaps most disturbing is the realization that the conditions that enabled the Blackwood family's crimes, social isolation, economic uncertainty, limited institutional oversight, and abundant opportunities to exploit vulnerable individuals, continue to exist in various forms throughout modern society. While the specific circumstances of frontier travel no longer create the same opportunities for systematic predation, the underlying social and psychological factors that enabled such crimes remain relevant for understanding how organized criminal enterprises develop and operate in contemporary contexts. So, what's your take on all this? Do you think the frontier environment created unique opportunities for such systematic evil? Or do you believe similar criminal families could operate successfully in any society with the right combination of isolation and opportunity? If you found this investigation into one of America's most disturbing criminal families as chilling as we did, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the dark corners of history that most people never learn about. Share this video with someone who appreciates true crime stories that reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature. And let us know in the comments what other historical mysteries you'd like us to investigate. The truth about our past is often more terrifying than any fiction and these stories need to be told to help us understand the depths of human capability for both good and evil.